In the centuries before the Viking Age began, Scandinavia lay at the furthest extremity of the known world. It had received little contact from the civilizations and empires that shaped ancient Europe, namely that of the Greeks and Romans. However, despite its geographic isolation, it was by no means culturally stagnant. The region was home to numerous Germanic tribes, scattered across the vast landscape in countless coastal communities and inland farms. The natural features of Scandinavia, with its dense forests and limited road networks stretching from the deep fjords of Norway to the low-lying archipelagos of Denmark and the extensive rivers and lakes of Sweden, made overland travel difficult, forcing such societies to be naturally oriented towards the water instead. In turn, this provided a reliable and accessible transport route that allowed for communication, movement, and exchange of peoples, goods, and ideas along Scandinavia's coastline. As the early medieval period began around the turn of the 6th century, Scandinavian society had begun to organize itself into kinship-based communities, headed by local chieftains who derived their power and authority from landholdings, a loyal group of followers, as well as success in warfare and trade. Political power was fragmented and widely decentralized amongst the region's local elites, who competed fiercely over what little agricultural land and resources were available. As a result, many Scandinavians began to look beyond their immediate confines and establish long-distance trade networks to other parts of the European continent to acquire whatever resources they needed. Together, this combination of political fragmentation, scarcity of resources, and an outward-looking trade base created the conditions necessary to bring about the start of the Viking Age. Central to this development was the evolution of Scandinavian shipbuilding and seafaring expertise. By the 8th century, Norse shipwrights had perfected clinker-built vessels that were both light yet strong, and capable of being either rowed or sailed across open water, up flowing rivers, or even hauled over land. The most important and iconic of these vessels to emerge was that of the longship. Narrowly built, with a shallow draft, it was designed for speed and maneuverability. The largest of these ships were up to 30 meters in length, with a crew of close to 100 men, and were sometimes ornamentally decorated with dragon heads and tails at the fore and aft. These longships were not solely used to carry trade, but were also used as instruments of war. Consequently, maritime trading and raiding developed not as separate activities, but as part of the same seaborne culture. By the 7th century, Scandinavian mariners had established a presence in the markets and towns along the Baltic and North Sea coasts, exchanging goods and absorbing knowledge of distant lands, all the while learning where wealth was concentrated, which routes or areas were poorly defended, and how local political instability could be exploited to their advantage. Seasonal raiding therefore grew coincidentally out of this commercial environment, as it offered a faster and more opportunistic means of acquiring wealth and prestige. The profits of trading and raiding were then redistributed by the elites to their followers, reinforcing their loyalty and increasing the social standing of ambitious leaders who could then amass larger retinues and more powerful fleets for coming expeditions. It was against this backdrop that the first widely recorded Viking raids occurred at the end of the 8th century. Off the northeast coast of England lay the island monastery of Lindisfarne, which in the year 793 fell victim to a raid by the Norsemen, who killed many of the monks and carried off a great deal of treasure in the process. This blatant targeting of an undefended site of worship sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world, many of whom viewed it as a desecrating assault by barbaric pagans. But to the Vikings, the targeting of an isolated, treasure-laden monastery proved to be easy pickings, and thus set the precedent for similar raids to follow in subsequent years. Throughout the 790s and into the first decade of the 9th century, Viking raiders struck other island monasteries and coastal communities around the Irish and North Seas. These early attacks were at first purely seasonal, with the longships setting sail in the summer to raid and plunder, before returning home for the winter. These coastal raids were so successful and lucrative that the Vikings soon moved on to targeting even larger and wealthier sites further inland by sailing up Europe's great rivers. In the year 845, 120 longships sailed up the Seine, sacked the city of Paris, and only left after being paid a large ransom. Similar cycles of raiding and demanding payment to leave were experienced elsewhere along the rivers of the Loire, Rhine, and Thames during the mid-9th century. But in the year 850, the Norsemen began to evolve their tactics further. That year, the Vikings overwintered in England for the first time, creating a more sustained presence that could exert greater damage over a wider area than waterborne raiding could achieve alone. Ireland had already seen such bases develop a few years earlier after the Vikings sailed up the River Liffey and established a fortified ship enclosure, known as a long fort, on the shoreline, thereby laying the foundation of what would become the city of Dublin in the year 841. The Viking presence in the Irish Sea region would intensify significantly in the following decades, with other towns such as Waterford, Limerick, Wexford and Cork also being founded. But the Norsemen did not simply confine themselves to these coastal enclaves, for they also assimilated into local Irish society and politics. Alliances were formed between Irish kings and Norse warlords, which over time led to marriages and families forming between the two groups. They adopted elements of each other's language and customs, which gave rise to the Norse Gaels, who dominated the maritime zones around Ireland, as well as into Scotland. Here too, a similar pattern of Norse raiding, settlement and colonisation had already occurred across Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, resulting in outposts of Viking power and influence across the Atlantic fringes of Europe that were connected to their Scandinavian homelands. But it was not only in the cold seas of northern Europe that the Vikings were forging a presence during this time, for they also began to venture further south. Viking raids were recorded along the coasts of Iberia, North Africa, and even into the Mediterranean during the mid-9th century, with cities such as Lisbon, Seville and even Pisa experiencing attacks. These sporadic raids continued on and off across much of coastal Europe for years, but in 865, another profound change in Viking ambitions materialized. On the southeast coast of England, a large Norse fleet landed in the autumn of that year. But they did not come to raid and plunder, they came to conquer and settle the land for themselves. The Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle referred to the immense Viking host, was supposedly led by the sons of the semi-legendary Viking warlord Ragnar Lodbrok, who sought to avenge their father's death after he was thrown into a pit of venomous snakes on the orders of King Eller of Northumbria. Whatever the truth of the legend, a large Viking army soon began marauding across eastern England, with York falling in 866 to become the centre of a powerful Scandinavian realm known as Jorvik. A few years later, the Vikings returned south to subdue East Anglia, followed by parts of Mercia. The only Anglo-Saxon kingdom to remain standing was that of Wessex, whose King Alfred the Great mounted a campaign to drive off the Viking incursions and secure the survival of Anglo-Saxon England. Eventually, by 878, the Great Heathen Army was defeated at the Battle of Edington, and, in the resulting peace settlement, the Vikings were permitted to retain control over much of the land they had conquered in eastern and northern England, which came to be known as the Danelaw. What followed was a profound demographic and cultural transformation, as more Scandinavian settlers arrived in the region to build farms and communities of their own. Many words from Old Norse entered the English language as a result of this influx of people, many of which are still with us to this day. Words like give, take, sky, skull, egg and window all stem from Old Norse, as do many of the region's place names. The martial prowess of the Vikings earned them a reputation of being both feared and respected on the battlefield. But if you've ever wanted to take command of an army yourself, then why not download and play War Thunder, the sponsor of this video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available now for free on PC, mobile and consoles. Take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships from 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armoured cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder, where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. Join a worldwide community of over 95 million players in epic PvP battles today, and delve into the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there's simply no game better suited for fans of military history. One feature that we particularly like is the game's sophisticated vehicle damage models, which intricately show individual components, like engines, fuel tanks, weapons and crew, all of which are susceptible to damage from enemy fire, just like their real-world counterparts. We'd recommend War Thunder to anyone with a fond interest in history, as you can get as close as virtually possible to taking command of a genuine historical war vehicle, which you can customize with countless camouflages, historical markings, and decoration options. Play War Thunder now for free by using the links in the video description or pinned comment to sign up. New players and those who haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack only for PC and consoles that includes multiple premium vehicles, While these struggles were playing out in the west, the Vikings were also expanding eastwards across the Baltic. Swedish Vikings, often called Varangians, developed trade routes through the river systems of Eastern Europe that linked the Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas. Furs, wax, honey, and amber from Scandinavia travelled southward in exchange for silver, fine cloth, and luxury goods from as far away as the Mediterranean and even Baghdad. Just as their counterparts had done so in the British Isles and parts of Western Europe, the Vikings who sailed eastwards to what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine assimilated with the local population and embedded themselves within the political structures of the region to form mixed Norse-Slavic communities. In the year 862, a Viking leader named Rurik established rule over Novgorod, and later, one of his followers named Oleg seized control of Kiev in 882, thereby laying the foundations of the Kievan Rus state, which would be a formidable power base across much of Eastern Europe over the next 4 centuries. The Vikings who traversed these eastern trade routes also came into contact with what was then the largest and wealthiest city on earth, Constantinople. The bustling capital of the Byzantine Empire offered the Norse traders almost every type of commodity, trinket, or treasure imaginable. It proved so alluring that Scandinavian and Rus fleets attacked the city on several occasions, attempting to take its bountiful riches for themselves. Though more peaceful relations were established in subsequent years, it was out of this contact that the famed Varangian Guard emerged, the elite imperial bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors, in the year 988. Renowned for their loyalty and ferocity in battle, the Guard drew its recruits exclusively from amongst the Rus and the Viking homelands, giving it an overwhelmingly Norse composition in an otherwise predominantly Greek world. As a result of this outward migration by the Norse peoples, Scandinavia began to undergo a process of change for itself, as the Vikings brought back elements of cultural exchange from lands they had visited. Up until this point, much of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had remained a contested patchwork of fragmented chiefdoms and petty kingdoms. They were nevertheless united in some cultural aspects, sharing a set of mutually intelligible dialects that together formed the Old Norse language, as well as worshipping a pantheon of gods that made up the Old Norse pagan religion. Deities such as Odin, the god of wisdom, poetry, and war, and Thor, the god of thunder, strength, and protection, were part of a wider natural world comprising various other gods and goddesses, as well as a plethora of mythological creatures, including elves, dwarves, and trolls.